Now, let me introduce our speaker for tonight. Margaret Cohen's most recent book, The Underwater Eye, How the Movie Camera Opened the Depths and Unleashed New Realms of Fantasy, will appear in April 2022, which means it's appeared, it's here, I'm holding it. Her novel, The Novel and the Sea, which was published in 2010, was awarded the Louis R. Gottschalk Prize from the American Society for 18th Century Studies and the George and Barbara Perkins Prize from the International Society for the Study of the Narrative. And I'm reading that right now, and it's really good. She is also the author of Profane Illumination, Walter Benjamin, and the Paris of Surrealist Revolution, published by UC Berkeley in 1993, and The Sentimental Education of the Novel, which is probably about Flaubert in some way.
About the ladies who challenged all that.
Nice. Which received the Modern Language Association's Aldo and Janine Scagolini Prize in French and Francophone Literature. She's the general editor of A Cultural History of the Seas, which came out in 2021, and she is a volume editor of A Cultural History of the Seas in the Age of Empire, the 5th volume of the 6-volume set spanning from antiquity to the present. And in another weird coincidence, Colin has a chapter published in The Cultural History of the Seas, right? Yep, so there we go, connections all over the place. So, without further ado, here's our speaker for tonight, Professor Margaret Cohen. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Gina, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you both, Gina and Colin, for inviting me. It's really an honor and a lot of fun to be included in this series, and to give my talk on the 189th anniversary of the day Moby Dick was published in 1851.
Today's the 109th?
Yeah, 89th. So what I want to share with you in this talk is an addendum to the book that Gina so kindly showed you, The Underwater Eye, where I was looking at blockbuster films that made a major impact on the imagination of the underwater environment in global modernity, mostly narrative, but also documentary at particularly influential eras in inventing documentary technology. But I didn't attend to whales at all in the book, in contrast to dolphins and sharks that play a big role. And I was wondering, as Colin asked me to give the talk, why? So you'll see when I review the filmography, I just found a practical answer. Whales are just really difficult to locate, let alone to get on the surface long enough to film. And then there's another suggestive correlation that I'll sort of be not directly talking about, but you'll see it, that the full whale, the full body, only becomes interesting to people with the takeoff of the environmental movement in the mid-20th century. And that seems to be the moment when people start to imagine it. Although going into conservationist history is beyond the scope of this talk. So I'll be showing some clips. And I need to warn you that whales were harmed and killed in some of the clips I'm showing. So if that's difficult for you, you should just know that. But I told you, I said in my abstract that I would end with the Grand Armada, but after Sharad Chari's marvelous talk last week, I thought that I should really start there. And pick up on the mysticism of Melville when he offers us just a rare glimpse into the undersea. Little was known firsthand about that realm in the mid-19th century, but the absence of knowledge is not necessarily an impediment to fantasy. So Jules Verne, for example, wrote 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. It was published in 1870 and imagined a planetary undersea environment. But for Melville, the undersea is a remote domain whose access is shrouded in awe-inspiring, if not insupportable, wonders. Pip goes mad when he glimpses God's foot on the treadle of the loom and the unceasing work of coral insects. And just parenthesis, in marine biology of the first half of the 20th century, coral insects were kind of the industrious proletariat of the sea. They were seen to build up corals, these massive accretions by all their little labors. In any case, the view of the cosmos in the chapter The Grand Armada is also rare and strange when we look into the undersea, and it's in the same, it's not the same region, but it's an adjacent region that Sharad mentioned. it's a particularly fraught space in the novel as it was in history. So I don't know if you remember this, but Ishmael starts the chapter with extensive details about the geographical location of the Grand Armada as a zone where the Indian and the Pacific Oceans come together, as well as the Eastern and the Western world. So I'm just going to read a brief bit of the narrative. Those narrow straits of Sunda divide Sumatra from Java, and standing midway in that vast rampart of islands, buttressed by that bold green promontory known to seamen as Java Head, they not a little correspond to the central gateway opening into some vast walled empire. And considering the inexhaustible wealth of spices and silks and jewels and gold and ivory with which the 1,000 islands of that Oriental Sea are enriched, it seems a significant provision of nature that such treasures, by the very formation of the land, should at least bear the appearance, however ineffectual, of being guarded from the all-grasping Western world. So this zone has historically been the repair of pirates because there's a great wealth passing through relatively unregulated waters. And in fact, the chapter opens with a pirates chasing the Pequod. So the hunters become the hunted, and the narrator tells us explicitly, not by any national force, but rather a motley crew right out of a popular adventure novel, with bloodthirsty pirates chasing Ahab as he to and fro paced the deck. In his forward turn, beholding the monsters he chased, and the after one, the bloodthirsty pirates chasing him, some such fancy as the above seemed him. So the whalers escape the pirates, they go back to work, they find the promising bounty it's interesting in this, and I don't quite understand why, in this gateway so practiced by humans, the gateway between Western and this Orientalist East, the whales seem to have found a respite from human empire. The whales hunted across all 4 oceans, and the narrator tells us that to escape overfishing, the whales have congregated, now I'm quoting, in extensive herds, that it would almost seem as if numerous nations of them had sworn solemn league and covenant for mutual assistance and protection. And what follows in the Grand Armada is a bloody chase, but there's also a very remarkable moment when the Pequod whalers are momentarily stopped by a peep into what Melville calls watery vaults that offer a brief reprieve and a truce. And there, they're not monsters, that image going back to the Bible, but rather images of fertility, generation, and maternal care. So looking down into the vertical dimension, looking down into the depths, the whalers behold, quote, the forms of the nursing mothers of the whales, and those that by their enormous girth seem shortly to become mothers. And there's a very lyrical passage that goes on to include even a description of newly born whale calves as if aliens in a very romantic way. So I'll just read a little bit of it. One of these little infants that from certain queer tokens seemed hardly a day old might have measured some 14 feet in length and some 6 feet in girth. The delicate side fins on the palms of his flukes still freshly retain the plated, crumpled appearance of a baby's ears newly arrived from foreign parts. Such a beautiful description. And there too, the crew of the Pequod observe, and this again is the narrator, young Leviathan amours in the deep. And also, they briefly fraternize with these whales that they were chasing and that they're going to go on to kill. The whales quietly eye the humans, and the humans eye them back, and then the humans touch the whales. So Queequeg patted their foreheads, and Starbuck scratched their backs with his lance. And it's just like a brief, moment of a pause, a breath, before a whale in agony crashes into the middle of this interspecies communion and disrupts the truth. So Melville's vision at this moment is beyond the reach of helmet divers at the time, who were considered, I guess, the miners of the sea, really. And they worked in jobs in marine engineering, coastal salvage. Here's a rare painting of such salvage work by the noted maritime painter Charles Roberts Ricketts, whose paintings were almost exclusively topside. So one of the surprises of my book was that 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea is a one-off, that people are not imagining the undersea world. So I started to dig into this in such a such an extended way, and that it's not until film that general audience and scientific interest alike really start to turn towards this realm. And it's interesting that marine biologists were just not interested in the possibilities of scientific diving, although it had been tried in 1840s in Sicily. And yeah, and in the secondary literature I've read about some of the industrial diving communities, they also don't describe the sea creatures except as they get in the way of their work. You know, now it may be that in the Seba Gorman archive somewhere there are logs of this, which would be really interesting. In any case, scientists started to grow interested in underwater life really at the turn of the 20th century, and then in 1912, the American J.E. Williamson invents the photosphere. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the history of underwater filming, and then in relationship to the filmography of whales. But I don't know, when you're working on Melville, you like to take detours. So one of my detours, I was curious if Melville's vision of whale life in the Grand Armada might have been based on what whalers observed. And because his fantasies, or Ishmael's fantasies, the narrator's fantasies, are very often rooted in the practical details of whaling, in contrast to Verne. So who should I go to, of course, but Richard King, who spoke a few weeks earlier in the series, and he's the author, as you know, of The Illuminating Ahab's Rolling Sea, a natural history of Moby Dick. So he pointed me to Charles Melville Scammon and his natural history, the marine mammals of the northwestern coast of North America, described and illustrated together with an account of the whale fishery from 1874, because Scammon was often hunting whales in exceptionally clear waters in the Gulf of California. And it's kind of a weird paradox that Scammon was the premier whaler on the West Coast, and he nearly made the gray whale extinct, and at the same time, he also wrote one of the most authoritative books of the time on marine mammalogy in the 19th century. And the Melville in his name is just coincidence. The Melville Society has been seeking links between Scammon and Melville fruitlessly, and I just think the link might be in the biology of the creatures being observed. So you can compare Moby Dick's description of whale calf nursing in the Grand Armada to Scammon's observation about the whale calf nursing, which should be in this plate. And he describes how by holding the teat between the extremity of the jaws or lips, while the mother reclines a little on one side, raising the posterior portion of her form nearly out of the water and lying in a relaxed condition, this peculiar manner of suckling the young appears to be common to all the whalebone whales. In this way, two calves would be enabled to obtain their nourishment at the same time. And you can see that what's really a remarkable view where Scammon takes you underneath the surface to see the behavior of whales in this clear water. And he also speaks of the amorous antics of whales in the mating season. He says, their caresses are of the most amusing and novel character. When lying by the side of each other, the Megapteras frequently administer alternate blows with their long fins, which love pats may, on a still day, be heard at a distance of miles. They also rub each other with these same huge and flexible arms, rolling occasionally from side to side and indulging in other gambols which can easier be imagined than described. And the reason I quote from this is because it seems like Queequeg and Starbuck are engaging in love play with the whales when they scratch and rub them. And so we could extend the queer readings of Moby Dick into an imagination of interspecies contact. So now I want to turn to what happens when underwater film is invented and the human gaze is able to plumb the depths and exhibit it on land, exhibit images of the depths on land. And it turns out, this was kind of a surprise to me, whales are latecomers to the party. And the charismatic megafauna in underwater film from the very beginning is the shark. So here's an illustration of the technology that let people take the camera undersea. This is it's called a photosphere, invented by a man named J.E. Williamson, who was the son of someone who repaired the undersides of ships. And Williamson had the idea in 1912 to take that technology to look under the ship and see what was rotted in the hull, and to put a camera inside, and then thus the photosphere was born. He assembled footage from the photosphere, which you can see an image of, and released the first underwater documentary, which was initially shared with scientific audiences to great success, as scientists claimed they were finding species never before discovered when it was first screened at the Smithsonian in 1914. And then in 1916, J.E. Williamson provided the footage for the first 20,000 Leagues actually shot underwater. Georges Méliès had made a fantastical imagination back in the early 20th century. But in any case, what you get in this is some very extended sequences of the underwater realm, and of course, the charismatic megafauna of the shark. So I'm just going to play you a very brief clip, which is the first time the general audiences could see the whole body of the shark. They could see sharks swimming. I didn't include this in the clip, but they also see the sharks and the divers in one frame. So the divers are actually, swimming with these apex predators. So here's just a brief clip from that. So those are the hunters from the Nautilus. It's a film of Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. I ask you to just retain that image of the shark gliding by and compare it to the iconography of the shark that, long dominated the Western imagination, which I exemplified here with John Singleton Copley's iconic painting Watson and the Shark from 1778. And there you can see that the shark is a diabolical creature with gleaming evil eye and huge jaws. And in the underwater views, the sharks become part of the natural world. They're majestic swimmers, they're predators at home in their environment. And this naturalization of the shark, it's not that it's not that the reality of predation has disappeared, but they are integrated into a natural environment. Of course, the myth of the Watson and the Shark type of, diabolical creature with these very bizarre, almost human lips and eyes is too good to give up. So it will continue throughout the history of Hollywood. And Jaws, which Gina mentioned, is kind of the blockbuster success of that. But still, I think it's interesting to compare the elegance and the kind of nonchalance of those sharks swimming at home with the diabolical, malevolent, evil creature in the Western imagination. So when does here's Jaws. This is Spielberg is brilliant. He withholds a view of what the creature is stalking until an hour mark into the film when the creature breaches the waterline, and there is what was in fact a mechanical monster, Bruce, the glitchy mechanical shark of Jaws, in that Copley-esque pose. So the great white whale comes onto the stage of film history in the 1920s, which is also the era when Moby Dick was really being rehabilitated as a great American novel. And so the first film that I screened in looking for underwater imagery of the whale was The Silent Down to the Sea in Ships, directed by Elmer Clifton. And this film, there's really not a mention of Moby Dick in this advertisement. It was an opportunity to record the craft of whaling during the age of sail, when whaling had spread to become a massive global industry, as it did in the beginning of the 20th century, starting in 1904. And so Down to the Sea in Ships was produced by the Whaling Film Corporation and financed by public subscription and made in and around New Bedford, Massachusetts. And it documents whaling operations and the seafaring culture of New England at the end of the era. So it's got a documentary whale hunt in it. It also takes quotes from Melville and inspired by his vindictive captain and vindictive whale, even if they don't mention Moby Dick in the advertisement. And I thought you would be interested to see just the beginning of the whale hunt in this film, which goes on almost for 8 minutes. And it is a whale hunt, filmed at sea by A.G. Penrod and Paul Allen, we're told in the introductory titles, which is pretty extraordinary filmography. They're in small boats with their cameras as they photograph this hunt. So it's a thrilling, gory sequence, and the knowledge that we're watching documentary augments its impact. And you'll see the whales are entirely imagined from the surface. There's no sense that the whales have lives below. So I guess I'll show you, oh my gosh, I'm already behind. I guess I'll just show you about a minute of this, and then and there would have been piano music playing, and actually there is to this, so I'm a little bit perturbed that maybe we've had a sound glitch again, but we'll see when we get to the sound films. Okay, so I'll stop the sequence there when the first harpoon is put in the shark. And the hunt will last 8 minutes, and at one point the whale overturns the boat. They have to get back in it. Yeah, so that is down to the sea in ships. Following that, there was a film that was more explicitly about Moby Dick that was released in 1926 called The Sea Beast, directed by Millard Webb. It featured John Barrymore as Captain Ahab Seeley, and it has an abridged whale hunt at the end without the detail of down to the sea in ships. And I guess I wanted you to see that the imagination of the whale is still as a monstrous creature for the person who drew the poster to attract audiences. He's very much drawing on the iconography of Watson in the shark in presenting this vindictive white whale. And again, the sea beast, the whale hunt, is entirely topside. So given what I've learned about the difficulty finding and filming whales, it's not a surprise that Williamson could not have documented them with the photosphere. But it's also true, there wouldn't have been a problem with using a model of the whale and submerging it if that had been in the popular imagination. We're in the domain of narrative film, after all, which is a domain of fantasy. And Williamson, in fact, had created a mechanical octopus, which he uses in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea for the moment when the octopus attacks the the Nautilus, and he was very proud of it. And so it's just striking to me that there isn't the interest in imagining the full form of the whale below. There isn't a grand armada interest in this first moment of the filmography of the whale. Now, jump forward to the post-war era, and the ability, World War II yields an incredible diversity of technologies that enrich the ability to plumb the undersea, from sonar to scuba to the technology for the portable camera, and this is actually a portable camera called the Aquaflex, being wielded by a Navy diver, an image from a book on Navy frogmen. It then leads to a boom in the history of underwater film, which I'd be glad to go into. I thought you might just be interested in seeing like what it was like to film on set underwater in this first era. This is an image of Making 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, which was the Disney Studios' first live-action film in 1954. It was a great success, as you know, with Kirk Douglas as Ned Land. And this is on set making the movie, which was actually filmed not in tanks, but in the sea. So given that there is a John Huston Moby Dick in 1956, right? I mean, this is the era of the takeoff of underwater film. This film, Huston's film, was extraordinarily high talent. It was starring Gregory Peck as Ahab, Richard Basehart as Ishmael, the appearance of Orson Welles as Father Mapple, it's the same year as The Silent World, so I was thinking that maybe I would find a full whale in this one, a whale seen underwater. Even if whales were difficult to film, it turns out that all the whales in this film that you see were made from parts, like props. There's an autobiography of the cinematographer called Huston, We Have a Problem, where he asserts that no full-length model of the whale was ever built, and the film company trolled the sea on the Pequod with a props barge nearby, and the barge carried various parts of the whale's body, tail fins, humps, etc., which were used as needed. And the only complete whale bodies were different-sized miniatures that were filmed in a special tank. And all the shots of the whale's head were filmed indoors, as they couldn't make the jaws, eyes, and other components work on the open sea. So there may have partially just been a technology problem there. And one of the whales got lost. In any case, I was hoping that maybe I would find my whale here. You don't, but you do find the eye of the whale. So I just am going to show you, screening clips is a little bit difficult because of all the copyright protection. So here is something, I kind of have to rely on YouTube. Here's a trailer, one of the first trailers. And you'll see as Ahab gets close to the whale, he sees the whale's eye. So when you're watching that, just think, what does that eye mean to you? Oh, yeah. So this film actually was a commercial success when it appeared, although when Spielberg wanted then to show Quint, right, the vindictive shark hunter modeled on Ahab in Jaws, he wanted to introduce him watching this Moby Dick. Apparently Gregory Peck refused because he detested his performance in it. So, okay, when do we get the first whales? Cousteau was a showman, Jacques Cousteau, and he was also a great underwater pioneer. If you've watch The Silent World, there's an excruciating glimpse of a dying whale calf underwater in it that the Calypso runs into. I have it in my outtakes, but I won't screen it unless you want to see it. But in the episode Whales from the Undersea World of Jacques Cousteau, that aired on November 15th, 1968, I found the imagery I had been seeking of whales mobilis in mobile, alive in their natural element. And I also found the explanation for why they come so late onto the screen underwater. Cousteau explains as a narrator why it's so difficult to film whales. First of all, it's the ability to find them in the vast sea. So little is known about them, even with sonar. Secondly, the whale sounds. So the ability of the whale to dive to such great depths means that you can't keep them at the surface long enough to film them. And then thirdly, their behavior is just really unpredictable. And so Cousteau's son Philippe would sum up these difficulties in 1972 to the New York Times. Whales are the most difficult animal the team has filmed because you can't follow them if they want to get away. That's why there are no good films of whales. To my knowledge, we're the only people who have underwater films footage of humpbacks in the open sea. When they do tolerate our presence, though, they take extraordinary care to avoid hitting us. You might see a monstrous fin coming at you like the wing of a DC-9, and you're sure it's going to split you in half, but just before it does, they curve and pass you. So I'm going to show you just a clip from this of the first underwater views of a whale swimming. So this would be the parallel to the sharks. Oh, I wanted to show you that the eye, I don't find the eye in the Moby Dick sequence above the water with, in the Houston film, particularly expressive, but I'll get to that. So here we have this historic moment from the Undersea World of Jacques Cousteau.
To set the second line.
They have to set what they call kytoons, which are apparently harpoons that didn't hurt the whales, in order to be able to track them and find them and film them. So they do this with a fin back with references to Moby Dick.
This is an historic moment. For the very first time, the finback whale is seen and filmed underwater in the open sea.
From our boat on the surface, the size and power of the finback frightens us. Suddenly, underwater, our fear changes to awe. Nothing has prepared us for the sight of such enormity, moving with such grace.
So you can see here Cousteau makes a contrast explicit between the topside view of the whale as this frightening creature and then the underwater transformation that occurs, such a magnificent creature, which has this sense of awe and I don't want to say sublime, but maybe we're getting into that territory. So the film is really, Cousteau he knows the history of film so well. He then takes you back to Nantucket to see a historic whale hunt, supposedly. So he's using Down to the Sea in ships as documentary film to show you what it was like to chase whales, and in the era of sail. And then he goes forward, he takes you to an oceanarium, which I think may have been in Redwood City, I was trying to track this down, and in the 1960s, there were actually some orcas in Redwood City, but he kind of fudges a little bit where it might be, and it suggests it might be in Southern California, which was the hub of science and dive and film. But in any case, then they set off on the hunt to find the sperm whale, the fabled sperm whale. And so it's a little bit, Wes Anderson was clearly watching this when he, was making the life aquatic with Steve Zissou, along with Blue Water, White Death, obviously. So when they finally find the fabled sperm whale, what do you think it is? They find it's not the fearsome killer of Moby Dick.
Second line.
Oh, I was going to go through, I can talk about the hunt with the harpoon, turning into the hunt with the camera. But in any case, since I'm a little short on time, let me just show you what they find. It's the Grand Armada. They find the mother and they find the calf. So I wanted to show you that sequence. But I also, and this wipes out the terrifying myth of the sperm whale as an engine of carnage, if any doubts were left. And it is the moment in environmentalist history when views of whales are really, as a species to be protected, are very strongly being endorsed. They end up filming the baby whale, and they put a small harpoon in it. They tell you that it's not going to have harm the calf. But before you get too sort of, warm and fuzzy about their choice to film the baby whale, it's also because the baby whale doesn't sound, and the baby whale is so much smaller. So it's just practically a lot easier to film the baby, to film the calf, than it is to film the mother. But in any case, let me show you a little bit. And you can see that the calf is a little bit annoyed. He's swatting at the divers with his tail at one point.
He's only a baby, yet he is 10 times the weight of a man. Because he lives in a realm of boundless food, he will grow to as much as 50 feet and weigh over 50 tons. In this manner, the entire species has thrived amid the plenty of the sea. In all likelihood, they will continue to grow larger and still larger for ages to come. Tagging done, I asked the divers to cut the baby loose. We dare not tamper longer with this marvelous child. He has served briefly to increase our knowledge, to excite our imagination in a way that few creatures have ever done. And now he must return to the mother, the herd, and to the nation that prowls the sea. Bonne chance.
So the nation that prowls the sea, it's, very explicitly the Grand Armada. So I also spent time showing you these extended sequences of the first films where it show whales underwater, because I put whale eye in the title of the talk. But as I watched them, I just had the feeling that the eye of the whale is really not what's so mesmerizing about the whale in these images, and that rather, it's the entire body. And I put the eye in the talk because I have seen in other images of marine life the eye used to suggest interspecies contact. So this is a Jojo, the grouper in The Silent World, who Cousteau called the groupers intellectuals of the sea. And I think it's because they sort of had bug eyes like Sarge. So here's another example of the eye as interspecies contact from Flipper. There's like a shot, counter shot. This is not the exact pairing, but there's a shot, counter shot, where you see the image of the boy looking up in an aesthetics of enwaterment, to use a term from a film critic named Andrea Deloya. And Cameron would do something similar with the intelligence of the NTIs in The Abyss to suggest this interspecies contact. So I was expecting to find that, and I guess I also had in my mind in the heart of the sea in the whale ship Essex, where it's that moment when Chase, I'm not going to play that for you, but it's the moment when Chase sees the eye of what is a CG whale, turns out, and problems of scale. They had to film it and film water. It's an interesting history. But in any case, that's what transfixes him. But I really think, having watched all these sequences, and I'm curious what you think, that it's the bodies. And so I just want to show you one more sequence. And this is from Blue Planet 2. I had to capture it on my iPhone because I couldn't figure out how to download such heavily copyrighted material. And the iPhone color correct so that the murkiness of the sea, this was a big problem when I was working on my book, turns out to be much bluer and more saturated than it is in the actual footage. But I think you'll see what is really interesting. And again, it's the Grand Armada. It's the mother and the calf. So let me just show you this, and then I have a concluding point.
Sleeping giant. The sperm. This family is resting between bouts of feeding. Who knows what the owners of the biggest brain in the planet dream about? One has a calf. It's about 2 weeks old, but still dependent on its mother's milk. It's hungry. It communicates with its mother using a pattern of clicks. But its mother slumbers on. The calf, covered in suckerfish, of which it can't yet rid itself, has to be patient.
So you can see at one point the mother opens her eye, but she and the baby don't make eye contact, and the communication with the calf is through clicking, which you hear on the soundtrack. And what I find entrancing are the horizontal is the shift from the horizontal to the diagonal views of the whales hanging vertically suspended in the dense atmosphere, and also the fact that they're sometimes sleeping on their heads. That's what really grabs me in this sequence. And so this image of the whale sleeping, the vertical whale, I was happy to see it on the poster for this year's Moby Dick, because I think it has a resonance in 2022 after this Blue Planet 2 that is very different from the vengeful monster of Jaws and suggests a much more complex view of the creature than the murderous associations of the great white shark. So let me wrap up. Throughout whale filmography, the whale's eye is included as an expression of sentience, but it seems hard to make it signify much other than the creature is a mammal, even if it's in the sea, and that we creatures who depend on vision so highly for our survival can draw likenesses to it. In the underwater clips I've showed you, the body of the whale is yet more expressive in its mass, its power, and the ability of such giant creatures to achieve neutral buoyancy in the big blue. So I think I may have been chasing something that was pretty human, and a mirror of myself, in billing this talk as about the eye of the whale. So at this point, I trail off a bit. So what do we do when we're talking about Melville and we trail off? We go back to Moby Dick. So I was curious to see what Ishmael had to say about the eye of the sperm whale. Indeed, this gives him some pause because the whale has eyes on, so distant that, well, let me just read it, not paraphrase. The whale, therefore, must see one distinct picture on this side and another distinct picture on that side, while all between must be profound darkness and nothingness to him. Man may, in effect, be said to look out on the world from a sentry box with two joined sashes for his window. But with the whale, these two sashes are separately inserted, making two distinct windows, but sadly impairing the view. This peculiar, and then he goes on to say, you should remember this in some subsequent sequences, and then he launches on a flight of metaphysics, and he suggests that the whale is the ultimate dialectician, that the whale can hold in his head two distinct prospects, look in two opposite directions, as marvelous a thing in him as if a man were simultaneously able to go through the demonstrations of two distinct problems in Euclid. So the whale seems capable of a kind of intelligence that's at a very high level of abstraction, but that's literal, or perhaps the whale sees in such a different way from us that the question starts to fall apart. So then this brought me to what I'm going to just call for the moment the whale effect, which is the ability of the whales to disturb received narratives. And this is something that D. Graham Burnett has traced in The Sounding of the Whale, a wonderful book. And one of the surprises in his keenly attentive and detailed study is this, that we're used to thinking of science as a tool of demystification. And with the rise of cetology in the mid-20th century, when scientists studied whales, they started to dismantle all kinds of wild legends, seafarers' yarns, biblical tales, I'm quoting from Burnett now, as they learn more about them with all kinds of new technologies, including harpoons, microphones, nets, neurological probes. But somehow what emerges in the process is a reenchantment, a new creature of extraordinary symbolic power that's composed out of broken old myths. So that reenchantment, of course, is not the whales alone. There are other charismatic megafauna that do it. But it's something that recurs throughout the accounts of people's direct experience with whales. So I thought I would return in closing to Cousteau, and I had quoted from that really history-making exhibition of the underwater views of whales in the episode in the Undersea World of Jacques Cousteau, where he contrasts the fear of the whale topside to the admiration of the whale below. But then in 1972, he published a book about his experiences hunting to film a whale. It's called The Whale, Mighty Monarch of the Sea. And he makes some surprising comments. So I'm just going to quote from what he says about the experience of the divers and that whole experience of the chase to find the sperm whale. Strangely, this observation of whales, interesting as it was, had a depressing effect upon me. We found what we came for, it's true, and there were whales all about us. But the very sight of them brought home to me the conviction that we, men and whales, were separated from each other by an impossible gulf, by a too great disproportion in size between them cavorting in the sea around a ship hardly bigger than they, and us who were clustered on that ship like ants adrift on a plank. And then he continues, he writes about his bitterness, or perhaps his impotence, that these marvels of nature are beyond us, beyond our senses, beyond our experience. They belong to a race of giants that requires of man an intellectual and emotional flexibility, an understanding, a willingness to break away from traditional concepts that is perhaps beyond him. And furthermore, Cousteau writes, the experience of those who die with whales, in contrast to the sense of fraternity that you get in the imagery of the film and the voiceover, is one of terror. So he uses that word. The whale's dimensions go beyond man's experience with life forms and beyond his expectations, so much so that incredulity follows upon astonishment. The mind rebels, the diver wonders whether he is not dreaming or deluded. On this point, all of our divers agree. The first sight of a whale in the water is terrifying. There is no experience on dry land that can compare with it. Another point on which there is universal agreement is that, when seen from the surface, these whales do not appear to be moving very rapidly, but for a diver in the water to touch a whale or to grab hold of it becomes an athletic experience or a nightmare. So I ask you to think of that in the sequences we watched with the divers seeming to fraternize with the whale on the tail. Now, this terror is born of a healthy respect for the massive strength of the whale and its mastery of an environment where humans can only survive with technology. And I think it's a corrective to the sense of closeness in many images used by whale conservationists, and that I expected to find, in my own focus on the eye. And I'll just say it's a reminder of the unhoming power of the sea to make us realize we are land-dwelling mammals, and to acknowledge as well all the human effort and skills that goes into figuring out how to dwell on, in, and with the oceans. Yeah, Gina.
We had a lecturer here a while ago that was talking about how this used to be seen as like dirty and dangerous, and only fisher people lived by the ocean, and it was like a poor people's thing. And then around the turn of the century, suddenly became like this health, like, oh, the sea is healthy for you, the air. But it seems like they're only talking about the top of the sea and not the bottom. So I know you talked about like top side of the whale and everything, but can you talk about that disconnect a little bit about how the sea was both at one time seen as super healthy, but then it's also filled with these beasts and monsters?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that gets very much into which sea where and what you're doing there. So there's a, I don't know if the speaker references, but there's a wonderful book by the cultural historian Alain Corbin called The Lure of the Sea, where he discusses, he's a historian inspired by Foucault, he discusses the emergence of the view of the sea as hygienic at the turn of the 19th century, which is very it like trickles down classes. So it starts out with the aristocracy, and then it goes to the middle classes, and then in the 20th century with mass transport, working classes get access to the sea. So you'll see the creation of seaside resorts where, they're cordoned off from the fishing villages. So the fishing villages where all the dirty work of, cleaning and hauling things up and the smelly fish guts and all that, are separated from the resort places, which are then surrounded with a whole apparatus to really make the divide. In terms of the undersea, again, I would say it's which sea and where. So if you're going to go diving at Tunnels Beach in Kauai, that's like a very beautiful coral reef that's surrounded by big hotels, and that sea is a clean sea, and it's an accessible sea. If you go to actually, the image that really comes to my mind, I went to Australia, to Queensland, and we landed in Brisbane, where at the time the Australian government wanted to just destroy part of the reef to make it shipping route for coal to China. So there you are in this airport that's like right at the center of all this massive industry, and then you go a couple hundred miles to the north, and you're on these coral reefs that are very beautiful and that are a tourist destination. And one of the striking things in my study was that people were just really not interested in the depths of the sea, even close to shore, even in Sicily in beautiful water in the 19th century. And the comparison with mining, I think, and the need to use technology to breathe is really kind of a hinge there. And that I also think that delayed marine science, because when you think about the era of navigation, you had the scientists and the officer classes on board the ship with working classes, so there was an exchange of information, whereas here the upper classes didn't go below. That was the work of the salvage divers, and it was exceptionally dangerous work too. Yeah?
I was just recently in Stillman's Lagoon in Baja, and whale watching, and they said that in both in the literature and the guides told us that the whale that was the inspiration for Moby Dick was from Scanlon's Lagoon.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. I don't
So
know if it.
there was a book published, I mean, if you really want to get into the weed, the seaweed, there was a book published, I think it was Sam Otter, who's here, who knows all things Melville, was it in 1841 called Mocha Dick, or The White Whale of the Pacific, and it was a thrilling, sea adventure story of the sort that Melville's publisher wished he would write, but that he didn't write. So my guess is, that it's like George Washington slept here. There are a lot of whales that inspired Moby Dick. In the heart of the sea, so Nathaniel Philbrick's book about the tragedy of the whale ship Essex being sunk by a vindictive whale, and, well, not a vindictive whale, being sunk by a whale, and the survivor cannibalism that ensued is also credited as a source for Yeah. Do you want to go first?
Sure. I was just really intrigued by the beginning of your lecture. I don't know offhand what year Moby Dick was written, but did Melville know when he was writing Moby Dick that whales were mammals?
Yes.
He did.
So it was, I think it's 1850, published 51, is that right?
And so it was common knowledge.
There was knowledge.
Thanks.
Why did you ask that?
I don't know. I just wondered. I haven't read Moby Dick. It would be really surprising to everyone here to know. I haven't even read the book. I have just really strong memories of seeing the movie as a kid. And so when I read the blurb about your lecture, I was like, oh, this is so intriguing, and just those memories of that Gregory Peck movie. That's what brought me here. So I got to read the book.
Or listen,
Or just come on Sunday.
It's pretty good. It's pretty good.
It's a pretty good book. Yeah, I hear it's pretty good.
Yeah,
So I thought, thank you for the talk. I thought it was fascinating to see the continuing appeal of the scene under the surface of the water with mother whales and nursing whales. And I wanted to go back to the Moby Dick passage you read from the Grand Armada, where in the passage you shared, a comparison is made between the baby whale and a human baby, but also the baby whale is described as alien. So I'm wondering how you see that scene working in Moby Dick. Is it anthropomorphizing the whale, making it familiar? Is it acknowledging a difference in the whale? That seemed to be something you were interested in across the talk. So I'm wondering what you make of that scene in Moby Dick.
Yeah, so thank you for that opportunity to bring in some things I left out. So of course, one thing I thought of was Wordsworth and this romantic notion of, the child as a kind of plague, or, the child is this sort of enchanted creature that's innocent. But I also think that actually all of Moby Dick is asking us to reflect upon our vision of the humans as sort of the measure of all things. So part of the talk which I left out was quoting from a biologist, a marine biologist named Carl Safina, and a wonderful book he wrote, Beyond Words, How Animals Think and Feel. I don't know if you know this book. But he takes the examples of the elephants, killer whales or orcas in the Pacific Northwest, elephants in Kenya, and the bulls of Yellowstone, and he uses this to make the argument that when we, have tests for what we think of as intelligence, we're thinking of it in terms of human intelligence. So to ask that a chimpanzee speak, or that an animal recognize itself in the mirror and see itself as self-aware, is to take what we think of, what is intelligence for us, and that's the eye for me and the eye for humans is so dominant, but not intelligence for the for survival that the animal needs. And so I was going to actually quote a passage where in Moby Dick, which is kind of, I'm going to garble now, but where the fantasy of Moby Dick, Ahab has just rolled every single evil thing together, and he's projected it and imprinted it upon the whale. And so that use of the natural kingdom to signify human kind of narratives that's like the big mistake in the book. I think you can read it that way. So it's showing you, and it just happens over and over again. There's like a minor catastrophe here where Queequeg loses his hat that we were talking about, but that's the big mistake of the book, is to anthropomorphize. And yet, without that, of course, you wouldn't have the story. So I don't know what you think about that.
Could you repeat the name of that book, Beyond Words?
Oh yeah, Beyond Words,
Beyond Words.
by a marvelous marine biologist named Carl Safina, Safina. He wrote another book that I love about the albatross, the eye of the albatross, that spends its entire life on the wing.
Is that a recent?
Beyond Words is 2015.
No, I mean that notion of that problem with Moby Dick.
Oh, gosh, I don't know. I'm going to turn to the dream team of medical experts in the back. No, in Melville scholarship, the anthropomorphization as like one of Melville's kind of central pet peeves, like how far back does that claim go? I don't know. I don't know if it's an environmental humanities kind of addition to the story, or if that's something. Yeah, Nancy?
Well, I've got two things on my mind. One is that it could, Coetsia's Elizabeth Costello, when she's giving the lectures at Princeton, has this same argument with, I think, a philosopher about, you can't compare the intelligence. You can't talk about the intelligence of an animal in terms of human intelligence. You're asking the wrong questions, you're making the wrong interpretations. So it's an interesting, I want to read Beyond Words because it just was such an interesting part of that novel. And now there's actually a marine biologist so I'll have to write that down, but not now. So I wanted, just in terms of what you said before, the eye, we've been talking about, does the eye have any significance? Or is it just an eye smacked on two sides of a giant head that you can't even see what's in front of it? And it just strikes me that kind of, gives you this sort of objective correlative for the question at the heart of Moby Dick, which is, does Moby Dick have any intentionality? Does Moby Dick remember what happened with Ahab and decide to get back and take revenge? Or, as Starbuck argues with Ahab, because he wants him to turn around and give up on this hunt, this is a dumb beast. It's purely running by instinct, and it has no intentions. It doesn't remember you. It has no plan to get you. But the question kind of remains, because Ahab's case is so strong in a way. So that was I just thought about that thing about the eye, that maybe it kind of stands for that, the question, does the whale have the same consciousness that we do? Is that eye, is that look kind of, you and me?
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I think there are more possibilities beyond, the vengeful quest and the just blind instinct. And, it could be survival. So, in Safina's book, he talks about the incredible memory that killer whales have, for example, and it's actually the grandmother killer whales who have this memory to lead the packs, the pods from one place to the other. And that they're making decisions all the time. And I have a colleague at Hopkins Marine Station who is trying to write a book from the vantage point of a mother shark, because he wants to undo the whole Jaws mythology, or at least he was a couple years ago when I got to take a look at it. But and he knows about, shark biology. The shark is continuously making decisions, food, not food, safe, not safe. It's this process continuously of assessing the environment. So, we can also imagine that whales have other kinds of intelligence that have to do with survival, if we're very functionalist about it, or maybe not. I mean, throughout the accounts of whales, there's a lot about whales playing, that doesn't seem to fit into a kind of totally functionalist model. So, there may be other possibilities, I guess. But, and Melville sings about the tail, right? That's the part that he wants to celebrate. And that is the part of the whale that is the most powerful and that the whale uses for defense. So, as always, he was right.
Yeah, and I guess this is kind of more of a comment, but when you're talking about, trying to imagine what it's like to be a whale, it seems to me a big part of it is the total difference in sensory systems. So, you look at the picture of the sperm whale and we focus on eyes because they're visual creatures. But actually the biggest sensory organ you see when you look at a sperm whale is a melon, right? So there's all of this 3D sensing, and there's some, indication that in odontocetes or the ones that use the echolocation, that they can build models, that they have models in their brain from the sensory system of the echolocation.
Yeah. And
they're not so much using their eyes, because if you think about like the humpbacks in Monterey, like the visibility in Monterey is terrible.
Yeah.
So they have these big eyes. I mean, the eyes are enormous, but there's not that much to see, and they have these sensory systems in the case of the echolocation, also in the case of the skin. Right? I mean, you think about the acreage of a humpback whale and how much skin that is, and how that's contacting the medium they live in all the time. So, we're very sort of outward focused, we're very vision focused, but the whales have these totally different sensory systems that makes them really alien, and I think it makes it harder to kind of gauge their intelligence, because they're just sensing things in a totally different way.
Yeah, that's super, super helpful. I mean, as you said, whales are nearsighted. I mean, because, so I did also have a part of the talk which I cut about, like, what do whales actually really see? So they see in grayscale. They want to be able to see light reflections off creatures around them, and they're nearsighted because, as you said, like the waters is like you can't really see very far. Anytime you go into a pool, just open your eyes and look what happens to distance, and it's a completely different experience. And yes, I'm just repeating what you said, but sound is really important. So it's interesting that it's just not as charismatic. I mean, the song "The Humpback Whales" was the greatest natural. So it was the greatest. It's one of these greatest LP albums of all time, and it helped convince Congress to pass the Marine Mammal Protection Act in 1972. So it was really it was a milestone. But we are visual creatures,
And like I said, it's just kind of interesting. So there's probably all kinds of sensory, like they're feeling. He talks a little bit about how they're very good at avoiding people. Well, they can't really see you, like, a big animal can't see a diver, so they're sensing all of the way that the water is moving around them, and like the world is very big to them, and I think it's hard for us to visualize what it would be like to be that big and have all that sensory input coming in all at the same time.
Yeah, no, that's super helpful. And if I could just kind of go back to the whole, like to Melville's scholarship to the 19th century, like the term we would want to use coming out of the 19th century is the sublime, right? The sublime is when our reason is overwhelmed by images of awe-inspiring power. But I think it's interesting to try to hone an aesthetic that is based upon this otherness, and just a whole different model rather than the overwhelming of reason, So I don't have a term for it, but it's provocative. Yeah.
I just hop on Grand Armada, so this is really exciting, and just to connect to a comment that was made about, like, is it like looking down at the innocent, like floating, is it being humanized or is it an alien, which I think is really interesting, but like Ishmael doesn't let us keep look at the beautiful baby, because 2 seconds later the other whale comes through and it's like milk and blood, like it's gross. So like if Melville is like, look at the beautiful baby and now I'm gonna kill it, that's like very Melville actually, but like the book does a lot of work to sort of like unsettle those, like, I know what I'm looking at, look at this beautiful thing, and now I'm gonna mess it up in some way so you can't really identify what you're looking at, which seems consistent with like a whales is so very strange, like how can you, as much as he tries to say like, I think in cetology, he's like, there you have it. And then here's a bunch of other stuff that
Yeah.
contradicts what I just said. And this is just a comment because you were talking about like maybe it's not the eye but the full body. And I just watched based on, I found it by accident because my television tastes are a little bit trashy. But National Geographic has a show called like Epic Adventures with Bertie Gregory, and they followed a big pod of fin whales. And it's very Grand Armada, and it's like, you know, it's dramatized for whatever, like they had to look for months, and then or a month, and they finally found it. But it's not just underwater; it's drones as well. So you're above the water, but you can see down, and it's all about their hugeness. And they find like 300. I can give you the anyway. If you want to see it, like I gasped. It's so incredible. But I also love that. Because he also talks about all the laws of how far away they have to stay, and the Jacques Cousteau, they're just like grabbing that poor baby whale. But the ability to see the full body, I think, is where the drama is, and that just seems aligned with what you're saying.
Yeah, and I'm curious, when you taught it, you can do an environmentalist reading of that chapter, I think.
Yeah.
Because he compares the whales to the buffalo, the lion-maned buffalo, and then at the end, he's got like this gust of wind from the whale tail that sweeps off Queequeg's beaver hat. You know, beavers were being trapped to extinction in the 19th century. Like, it's such a random thing that I had to look, you know, why would the beaver hat fall off? So I think that, I mean, that it's, on the one hand, it's Melvillian to show you beauty and then to just like have it all fall apart. Right. And the other hand, and you know, one doesn't want to make it an allegory either, but that the environmentalist train of thought is kind of open there. And you know, people were worried about whale overfishing already, you know, in the 1850s.
Our first speaker that we had here, Alyssa Criquet, the filmmaker, she was talking about how people were so unfamiliar with whale bodies that when they were doing the whale embalming, her talk was on embalmed whales that they would drag around the country in semi-trucks for people to see for 50 cents or something, but that people thought the whale would be alive because they had no idea of how massive it was. And so people would show up and then be disappointed that it was like, oh, it's dead. We thought it was going to be, which seems ridiculous now for anyone to think, like, wait, how would you have a live whale on a flatbed truck? But that's just that disconnect, even up until the 20s that people.
The advertising certainly led them to hope that the whale would somehow be alive.
So it's just interesting about the whole whale body, like they had such a non-concept of it.
Yeah. And didn't she mention that P.T. Barnum had, like, he captures the belugas, which he was able to keep alive for a day or two, you know, back in the 1860s, and then they died.
I taught a memoir class, and one of the old ladies grew up in West Texas. She was a kid in about right around 1930, and one of those flatbed trucks came into the oil town, and she remembers like paying her dime, and she said the stench was incredible because it was rotting. Even though it was embalmed, they couldn't really keep it fresh, and she just remembers that so much from her childhood of this enormous kind of monster in the middle of the West Texas desert.
Just a comment. There was a photographer, there's an exhibit here by a photographer, it's called The Eye of the Whale, and I'm not remembering his name, but he had this good fortune of like being on the surface of the water with whales who hung out with them for a while, and he took pictures just like bit by bit by bit of the whale up close, and then, you know, printed them out, put them together, so it's like a full-on photo of the whale.
Brian Austin is his name.
Yeah, it's incredible because he wanted to get people to be more, you know, to see the actual eye of the whale, but all the details up close, all the barnacles, everything, and also to try to get whaling nations to see the whale a little bit differently than they do.
Yeah, I think I don't mean to interrupt you. I actually that's another outtake from the talk. I had the book is called Beautiful Whale, and it came out in 2012 or 2013. And as you say, you know, most people shoot whales with a wide-angle lens, and so the resolution is really poor. But in order to be able to show the detail and get up close, he used a much narrower focal point, which meant that he was right, you know, next to the whales. And then, as you say, he assembled all the pictures. And what I was going to bring in is a quote from him where he says that his experience of being next to a whale was very disturbing, that it was difficult. And that sense of, you know, this whale effect, that the whale perturbs you in being in its presence, I thought was quite strange. It's an incredible book of photos, and how to get the scale of the whale, even, I mean, it's a large book. I don't, you know, it must be about this big, and then they're foldouts, you know, so it shows you just like how dramatically, you know, difficult it is to represent.
And his photos were huge.
It's called Beautiful Whale, and the photographer is Bryant Austin, Austin. I would have loved to see that.
Yeah, the exhibit, they used to have some at, well, they don't have many more, so it doesn't matter, but you know, you go into the room and the photo is as big as, you know, 2 of these bookcases that he put together at least. They're incredible.
Great, well, thank you so much. Great talk, and I will say that it is October and it's spooky month, so if you want to watch Jaws, that's that.
Is the 7-volume book that you referred to that you in this library?
7 volumes.
Oh, my 6-volume cultural
6.
history of the sea from antiquity to the present.
That's the one. Is it in this library?
Yes, I have a couple of volumes
Oh,
of it.
good.
Yeah. So.
I think I got volume 6.
Yeah, I think I'm volume 6 in Colin for sure.
Right.
So.
Totally.
It's in there.
Start with 1 and you're up to 6.
Thank you, that was great.